Rama is the beginning, the very beginning of the second millennium. It so happens that the archaeology of the Ayodhya site reaches about that far. That could confirm it, although you must say that what the archaeologists have found is that there was a human habitation at the site, not exactly the grand palace of the great solar dynasty that you might expect. Romila Thapar at one point has said, yeah, but the real question is, did Rama really live there? Well, no, that's not the real question. When you call a country Bharatvarsh or just Bharat, what you are effectively doing is you call it Veda land. Modi henceforth calls India Veda land. What would the reaction have? See, Hindu fanaticism.
Namaste. Ayodhya has lived in the hearts and minds of people for centuries. In the minds of devotees, Ayodhya is a very special place. But in the minds of political people, Ayodhya has been a site of dispute and a lot of friction. We welcome Dr. Elst with us today at Sangam Talks. We are here today to talk about his new book, Forever Ayodhya. This book is a compilation of Dr. Elst's writings from the year 2011 to 2023. And this is a book which is rich with history of the many disputes that surround Ayodhya, the many dialogues that happened, many evidences that were disputed, and plus his own very, very sharp observation on Ayodhya as an academe, as a political writer, as a scholar. So, Dr. Elst, let's begin at the very beginning. When did Ram live? Or the more important question, did the man ever live?
Yeah, well, some people say that it's all mythology and a poet's fantasy. That is very unlikely. You see, I noticed that there are so-called rationalists in India who think that this is a very modern and enlightened view, and that all these Hindus with their Rama and all the other mythological heroes are all living in the past. Now, that is a bit of an obsolete view. You see, in the especially second half of the 19th century, among historians, you had their own version of scientism, of a very exaggerated confidence in science and disparaging of everything else. So they believed that everything that people used to believe in was not true, like the story of the Iliad of Troy, they thought was just a fantasy. A number of items mentioned in the Bible, for example, the Hittite people. There are a number of characters that are described as Hittite people. They didn't know of any Hittite people. They said that this must be fantasy. Even a few free thinkers thought that Jesus had never existed. And it was soon found out that this was all wrong. An amateur, somebody whom the academics did not take serious, namely the retired businessman Heinrich Schliemann, used all the money he had earned to organize an excavation at the supposed site of Troy, and he found Troy. So no more discussion, here it is. Then the Hittites in the Bible turned out to be historical. And they discovered texts of these Hittites, and gradually their cities were dug up. A number of the characters in Troy become understandable using the Hittite sources. Like some of the names are Hittite. And then the language was deciphered and so on. So this turned out to be truly historical. As for Jesus, you see, today no scholar is going to doubt the existence of Jesus. Of course, everybody doubts, or most people doubt, that he was the Son of God, or that he was born of a virgin, or that he was resurrected. Those things are fantasy. But that he existed, yes, why not? And so similarly with Rama, Rama is part of the dynasty, the solar dynasty in his case, that is quite well attested. Now here again, Indian rationalists are going to say, yeah, but the king lists of the Puranas, they're all nonsense, they're all invented. Well, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they too have king lists, and there wouldn't be books about the history of Egypt or Mesopotamia but for those king lists. So it's only because of the disparaging of Hindu culture that they don't take these lists seriously. I mean, here and there may be a few corrections necessary, but overall, they're quite coherent, and different sources. You get, different king lists, but almost the same. And so in general, this is quite reliable. So Rama definitely existed, was the son of Dasharatha, the grandson of Ajah, the great grandson of Raghu. And so about his existence, there's no doubt. About the chronology, there is a bit of doubt, but not very much. Of course, the traditionalists give extremely old dates. And they start with the Mahabharata, which they situate in the 32nd century BC, and then Rama a lot earlier. If you take seriously the chronology of the 4 yugas, the 4 world ages, then you're really in trouble. Because Rama supposedly was the Treta Thakur, the lord of the Treta Yuga, and then there is the whole Dwapara Yuga, and only at the end of it, the last generation in the Dwapara Yuga, you get Krishna of the Mahabharata, which means that the whole Dwapara Yuga is in between. How long is the Dwapara Yuga? Well, it's a very artificial system, these 4 world ages, or at least the attribution of a specific number of years to them. And so the classical Puranic version is that there are 864,000 years to the Dwapara Yuga. So Rama lived practically 1,000,000 years ago. Now that is nonsense. And it is also explainable where that whole system came from and how this mistake crept in. But so we need not, at least in this format, we will not go deeper into this. More realistic is the calculation that Jijit Nadumuri Ravi gives, where he says, well, Mahabharata, first half of the 2nd millennium BC. And so there are different dates possible, and some people have calculated with all the astronomical indications in the book to specific years. 1484, I think, 1504, 1783, but it's that age range. Then when did Rama live? Well, very surprisingly, this whole Dwapara Yuga between Rama and Krishna is only 100 years. And actually, if you read the text closely, you even find the testimony fairly explicitly. You see, in the time of Rama's conquest of Lanka, his fellow Hanuman is a young guy. He's like 20 years old. And so, yes, he's very agile and so on, as people are at that age. Now, there is a later story where he's an old man who can hardly move. So it's like 60, 70 years later. And he meets a young man who is Bhishma. And in the Mahabharata, you get Bhishma as an old man. So between there may be at most like 120 years. So Rama is the beginning, the very beginning of the 2nd millennium. It so happens that the archaeology of the Ayodhya site reaches about that far. So that could confirm it, although you must say that what the archaeologists have found is that there was a human habitation at the site, not exactly the grand palace of the great solar dynasty that you might expect. It is, first of all, not clearly the seat of the solar dynasty, unless new archaeological findings change the picture. But so far, you cannot go back to Ikshvaku and Manu and so on thousands of years earlier. That's
Right.
clearly not the case. When the famous archaeologist B.B. Lal met the sadhus to explain his findings on Ayodhya, he said yes, there was a Hindu temple there, so that they liked. But you see, my spade only goes back to the second millennium BC. Now that they did not like, because they thought that Rama was 1,000,000 years ago, or at least several thousands more. So that turned out not to be the case. So they protested vehemently, and he answered, "Well, yeah, I mean, I respect your doubt, and so I'm not saying this, it's my spade that says it." Now, it so happens that this can be reconciled with the story of the Ramayana, because Ayodhya actually moves place a few times. And so the present city of Ayodhya was built by Aja, who is the grandfather of Rama.
Okay.
Also, within Dasharatha's career, he also moves the people around within the city's area, but still, you can see that it's a very dynamic picture. Also, they had to be dynamic because the river has a life of its own. It shifts
Course.
several times. It also floods, and in fact, indications are that Rama died in a flood. So, which is a very human thing to do. You see, that's very typical about these so-called incarnations of Vishnu. You see, Rama dies in a flood, Krishna dies in a hunting accident, the Buddha dies of food poisoning. So it's all very ordinary, very human. Anyway, so the original capital of the Solar Dynasty may have been elsewhere. And here, I have to do some rethinking. In Sri Kantalagiri, you find the idea that the whole beginning of Vedic history is in Ayodhya, where the solar and the lunar dynasty both originate ultimately. And so that Ayodhya may not be exactly at the site where, we think it is. Indeed, the most sacred place for the Vedic people is Ilaspada, the footprint of Ila. Ila is not the founder, her son is the founder, but so the start of the lunar dynasty to which the Vedic rishis belong. And so that Ilaspada is on the Darshadwati river, which is in Haryana, or between the Darshadwati and the Saraswati. And so if they come from the east, maybe the east isn't that far. Maybe it's not all the way in eastern UP where now Ayodhya has. Maybe it's only just a few miles from where they actually live.
Okay.
It's like now, you see, when you speak here in Delhi, you go to the east, it might mean you go to Calcutta, but it might also mean you go to Noida. So, that exact location I leave open. You see, the jury is still out on that. But at any rate, by the time of Rama, it's Ayodhya. So that is for sure. Was it the exact location? Probably, although there I would leave something open. They have pinpointed this location, and it has been that location for thousands of years. And so Romila Thapar at one point has said, yeah, but the real question is, did Rama really live there? Well, no, that's not the real question. You see, religious conventions about sacred sites do not have to be believed in order to be respected. Like, for instance, in France, you have a sacred site, a Catholic pilgrimage place called Lourdes, where supposedly the Virgin Mary has appeared. And so all the French, intellectuals used to laugh at that. And you have a whole string of very militantly secularist governments in France, and all of them laughed at this tradition. Nevertheless, they facilitated pilgrimage there. They didn't question this site. They didn't say to the Catholics, now, first prove that the Virgin Mary appeared there. Only then will we... No, you see, the same thing for Mecca, for example. You see, the location of Mecca is very much put in doubt by historians. Did Muhammad live there? Did any people live there at all? This is very doubtful.
Precisely.
And so they say that the actual location of Mecca was Petra in Jordan. But, I mean, nobody asked that question. If the Muslims among themselves agree to go there, then, we let them go on pilgrimage there. So the real question is, shall we respect a Hindu sacred site?
We know that in 1859 or so, there were these huge riots in that Ayodhya area. And in perhaps 1885, Mahant Raghuveer Das filed the first suit to lay claim on the Ram Janmabhoomi. So we know that the Hindus really believe that Rama was born there and he actually lived there.
Yes.
But for the current very scholarly minded Hindu, these things are also very important to define that Rama lived so many years ago and he was a real person. So therefore, what you just told us becomes very relevant in that light. Also, Dr. Elst, do you think the way literature is written, if you look at the Charan literature, the Bardic literature from Rajasthan, they claim that a person had maybe 5 crore followers. But those 5 crore people did not live in his lifetime. What he actually means to say is that future people will also benefit from his sermons, from his life, from his hagiography.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the claims on Ayodhya can also be seen in this light? The claims on Rama's life and Rama as a historical person?
Well, the claim on Rama has to do with, of course, the deification of Rama. I mean, there are many great figures in Indian history that have not been deified and that therefore are not the object of pilgrimage. Like, for example, a few weeks ago, there was a lot of commotion because the G20 visitors were invited to some ceremony led by Draupadi Murmu, the president of Bharat. Okay? Now, Bharat simply means of Bharata, but which Bharata? You see, there are many Bharatas in Indian history, all named after the original Bharata. Just like, I mean, all Alexanders in the world are ultimately named after Alexander of Macedon. So, and there were a few, mistaken ideas in the press bandied about. Like for instance, the choreographer who wrote the Bharat Natyam, that was also a Bharata, but that's not the Bharata we're looking for. So this is about the king who of the lunar dynasty, who founded a branch of the lunar dynasty, in whose court the Vedic poetry was started. Poetry is much older, but the idea of codifying this and learning by heart and passing on and so on, that's the Vedic tradition. And so that starts with King Bharata. So why is Bharata unique? Why is India not called, let's say, Kurukshetra, the field of King Kuru? Well, you see, Kuru may have been great but he was no match at all for the historical importance of Bharata. Why? Well, because Bharata did not start just anything. He started the Vedic tradition. And so first, by military means, it expands to most of North India, thanks to the conquests of King Sudas, his descendant. But then politically it doesn't go well anymore. There's this civil war, which is the object of the Mahabharata epic. Anyway, it doesn't matter because by then the Vedic prestige is such that many kings throughout India want to be part of that. And they invite Vedic reciters to settle in their country. They get these agraharas and so on, they get tax facilities and so on, because they per se want to import the Vedic culture. And so the whole of India then becomes Bharata. You see, it's maybe not politically controlled by the Bharata dynasty, but culturally it follows the lead of this Bharata dynasty. So when you call a country Bharatvarsh or just Bharat, what you are effectively doing is you call it Veda land. You see? And so in this discussion, of course, the Indian bugbear of secularism has been brought up. And India at least is secular. And then the Bharatiya said, yeah, but Bharat is also secular. Well, I don't know. Imagine that news had been brought in the Times of India or abroad in the New York Times. Modi henceforth calls India Veda land. What would the reaction have? See, Hindu fanaticism. Okay? But so actually that's what happened, you know. Nevertheless, in spite of the enormous importance of King Bharata, nobody's going on pilgrimage to wherever it is that he lives. Most people don't know where he lives. So the special place of Rama and of Krishna has to do with their deification. So, you know, they don't go on pilgrimage to just anywhere, but specifically to where these gods have been born.
Dr. Elst, nowadays we have a lot of Islamic iconoclasm apologia that the Muslims did break the monuments of Hindus, they did break temples, they did desecrate them, but because the Hindus also did the same.
Yes. Well, that's the new line. The old line of the so-called eminent historians was to deny this iconoclasm. This is all Hindu propaganda, but the evidence is just too loud and clear. And so a big step was Sitaram Goel's book, Hindu Temples, What Happens to Them, which lists about 2,000 of such temples destroyed by Islamic iconoclasm. And there are many more, like for instance about Kerala, which was the area of India that was most spared from Islamic iconoclasm. He gives but a few. But then someone from Kerala has written a book expounding this and giving everything that Tipu Sultan and the Mopla rebellion have destroyed, and that's still very many. So these 2,000 are only a beginning. You know, this is it's much worse. And then also, if one vandalized temple site is mentioned, that doesn't mean one vandalization. The Somnath temple has been destroyed 8 times. And so the same thing with the Ayodhya site. It has been a first temple, well, maybe not necessarily the first, because buildings also get dilapidated after a while and rebuilt and so on. But at any rate, the one that was standing there in 1030 was destroyed by Salar Masud Ghaznavi, the nephew of Mahmud Ghaznavi, who was then defeated a bit later by Raja Suheldev and Raja Bhoja in the Battle of Bahraich. So then they were seemingly rid of the Islamic problem for some time. But then in 1192, Muhammad Ghori wins the Battle of Tarain, And then the real Islamic invasion of the entire Gangetic Plain starts. And so in 1993 or 94, it is his nephew, Shah Zuran Ghori, who conquers Ayodhya. And this, I mean, that campaign, which goes all the way to Assam, is the largest orgy of iconoclasm in world history ever. And you heard, of course, of the Buddhist universities that get destroyed in that campaign by Bakhtiyar Khilji. All the temples in Kashi get destroyed. It's only a few places that are out of the way of the armies that get spared, like the Mahabodhi temple or like Khajuraho. But so everything gets destroyed. Now, what about Ayodhya? So many places get destroyed. Like, for example, there is a temple there which has been rebuilt later. I've visited it for Adinath, the first Tirthankara of the Jains. They have a presence there, the Buddhists have a presence there. And so everything was destroyed. But what happened to the Rama temple? You see, after Ghaznavi destroyed an earlier Rama temple, the Rama temple was rebuilt in style. The really big Rama temple by a Rajput king. And what happened to that temple? Now that is the temple which archaeologists have dug up, or the foundations of it. There were earlier partial excavations, but in 2003 there were the court-ordered excavations of the whole thing. They made sure that there were enough Muslims among the excavators and so on, so that nobody could say that there was Hindu manipulation and all that. So it is very, very, very sure that that temple existed. And it was also demolished and replaced with a mosque. But when? Okay, that's a big question. And so we know for sure that the place was victim several times of Islamic iconoclasm, but we do not always know when. And so the story you always hear is that that big temple is the one destroyed by Babar in 1526. Well, that's very unlikely. I mean, if you take the problem of iconoclasm seriously, then you must wonder, and indeed at the time of the debate, 1990-91, the Muslim leader Syed Shahabuddin did pose that question. You see, how come that temple remained standing all through the Sultanate period, which, when Ayodhya was moreover a provincial capital of the Sultanate, which means that there was a Muslim garrison, there was a Muslim governor permanently looking at this great place of Hindu pilgrimage for 300-400 years and not doing anything about it. What is this? And so, me too, I think that then, 1194, this temple too was destroyed. Of course, Hindus kept flocking to it as much as they could, because after all, for them, it's not the temple that is important, it's the site that is important.
Yes.
But I think they had to do without the temple, and that a mosque was subsequently built. And so during the debate, archaeologists of both parties agreed, not all of them, but some of them did, and I think rightly, that the mosque dates from the Sultanate period.
Okay.
There is maybe 1300 or so. And that it is not Babar who built it. You see, what happened at the end of the Sultanate period, there's a period of chaos. Since Hindus kept on flocking to the site as much as they could, well, here they could retake the site. You see, the situation was not conducive to actually rebuilding a temple, but at least they could use the mosque as a temple building, which is exactly what they did between 1949 and 1992.
Right.
And then you see it is that presence which was again destroyed by Babar. And then he built his gate, which had the inscription that it is his own lieutenant Mir Baki who built the temple. Well, maybe he built the gate. But okay, anyway, so that's a very pertinent case of iconoclasm. By the way, nobody here speaks about Aurangzeb. So there are sources that say that it is Aurangzeb who destroyed the temple.
All right.
And indeed, in the later years of Akbar, you get a lot of rebuilding of Hindu temples, like the Somnath temple, like the Krishna Janmabhoomi, like the Kashi Vishwanath. They all get rebuilt, and then later Aurangzeb is again going to destroy them. What happened in Ayodhya? So there are several sources who say Aurangzeb destroyed this, which is eminently sensible, only we have no record of it that I know of. So perhaps, you see, the Hindu worship at the site was destroyed 4 times by Salar Masud Ghaznavi, by Shah Suran Ghori, by Babar, and maybe by Aurangzeb. At any rate, the problem is Islamic iconoclasm. So you shouldn't do as some people do, to accuse Aurangzeb, oh, he was a cruel man, blah, blah, blah. No, you see, he was a pious man. He was very ascetic, which is a virtue according to Hindus, who, unlike his father, who threw away tax money on building the expensive piece of vulgarity that is the Taj Mahal. You see, he was, like, for instance, he didn't want a wage from the state. He earned his own money by calligraphing the Quran or by stitching these head caps. So he was a nice man. I mean, of course, he killed his brother and so on, but as kings go, he was not too bad. But for the same reason why he was, an ascetic man, he was also a temple destroyer. You see, the motive was the same, Islam. So as he got older, suddenly he got religion. And so he was already a Muslim, but now he started taking Islam serious. And so he said, you see, my father, grandfather, great-grandfather, they allowed all this idolatry to go on, which was sensible for an emperor, in the sense that an empire becomes a lot more stable if you give people some, let them do their thing as long as they remain loyal. And so he became, fanatic. And so he redid what all his ancestors had also done, what the Sultanate had done, what Mahmud Ghaznavi had done. And so that's not because he was this or that, no, that's because Islam told him to do so. So, yes, you see, there is this Islamic history. In the beginning, they tried to deny it, but it's so obvious, there's no use denying it. So the new line of attack is to say, yeah, there was a little bit, as little as possible, but there was some Islamic iconoclasm, but that's because of the Hindus.
Yes.
Now, first of all, they think you're really, really village bumpkins to say a thing like that. You see, they think that you think that the world is not bigger than India. You see, Islam had a history before it came into India. And so over there was also plenty of iconoclasm. And, it starts with Muhammad. In Medina already he has several places destroyed, graveyards dug up, and anything that had to do with paganism he was against.
So he actually lays down a blueprint for all that follows.
Well, here it comes. When he conquers Mecca, his hometown, he goes straight to the Kaaba, and the Kaaba has 360 idols, which with his own hands he destroys. And so that's the example that is always going to be given by Muslim conquerors who do the same thing.
Yes.
They are repeating the precedent of the Prophet, which is the basis of Islamic law.
Yes,
You
yes.
can't go to an Islamic court and say this is
Wrong.
bad, this is wrong, when the other party can say, but this is just the example of the Prophet.
Precisely.
And so that Islamic iconoclasm is very Islamic. Now, the other argument that they use to say, oh, but this the Hindus doing, is that, well, actually, they were following the precedent of Hindu rulers who had done the same thing. First of all, they have never been able to show any Muslim text where they say, I am doing this because my Hindu predecessor did it. You know, they cite Muhammad or they cite Mahmud Ghaznavi and so on. They never cite any Hindu king. Then it is true that a few Hindu kings and many more outside India, Mesopotamia and so on, had a practice of kidnapping the main murti from a temple. They didn't destroy the temple. They certainly didn't destroy the murti. They did exactly the opposite. They took the murti with them and installed it in their own temple, and the worship continued. And in the other place, the loser's place, you know, they didn't have the murti anymore, but they were perfectly free to install a new murti.
one.
And again, the worship continued. So there you see the rivalry is only about a material object. Whereas in Islam, the idea is to destroy a religion. And so these idols are simply an embodiment of that religion. You see, if you can show me that a Muslim conqueror like Ghaznavi, when he went to Somnath, took the idol back home and installed it in his own mosque to worship it, well, then your point is made. But until then, you see, this argument is very silly.
Now, coming to the court cases that involved Ayodhya.
Yeah.
So we know that the first suit ever was filed in 1885, and thereafter these proceedings continued. And 1936, the namaz was stopped at Babri Masjid.
Yes.
So what was happening in the meanwhile?
Well, let's start with that court case. In that court case, the Hindus claimed the site, which was then used by Muslims. I specify this because this was probably not always the case. The first descriptions by European travelers describe Hindus going there, especially on Ram Navami. So you see, when the war activities had passed and the situation renormalized, clearly Hindus managed to retake some kind of control of the site. So apparently they left the mosque building standing, but at least on certain occasions they managed to use it for Rama worship. And so Father Tiefenthaler, for example, in 1767, he, for instance, mentions it was destroyed by either Babar or Aurangzeb. He's one of the sources for Aurangzeb.
Yes.
But, of course, that may be, local tradition. People remembered Aurangzeb, only a few decades earlier, as famously destroying many temples. So they may have simply attributed it to the one they know rather than to some figure from history. So, I mean, it's always questionable how reliable these local traditions are. Anyway, but so he holds it possible that it was by Aurangzeb. Anyway, what he describes is Hindus holding a festival there. But so at any rate, in the British period, clearly Muslims are using it as a mosque, and so Hindus want it back. Now, the first thing to note is that nobody there argues against the temple demolition. You see, neither the British themselves, nor the local Muslims, nor, of course, the Hindus. And so the British judge rules that, yes, this temple was demolished, that's very unfortunate, but since it is already 300 years ago, we're not going to reopen this issue. The consensus clearly is that, yes, there was a temple, and yes, it was destroyed to make way for a mosque. So then there was, of course, some local dissatisfaction with that, which leads to riots. And so in 1936, the British have enough of it, and they close the place. They also do repairs. That's important, as we will see later. They use cement, you see, modern material to repair the roof, whereas the rest of the building is old and dilapidated. You'll see why that is important. Anyway, so the place is closed, and then in 1949, when Islam is badly on the defensive and everybody blames it for the partition and all the concomitant misery, then you see Hindus think the time is ripe to make it into a temple again. So they install the idols of Rama, Sita, and of Lakshmana. So from then on, it functionally becomes a temple, even though the building is still a mosque. Government more or less closes the place for general worship, but a priest can come and do the puja for the idols, for the murtis. I know Hindus are quite particular about this word, idol. So that remains the status quo until 1986. So Hindus go to court in 1950. Muslims follow years later, but just in time for a valid complaint. And so the court case has been going on since 1950. It has closed in 2019, 69 years. But then it is just a court case. And it is only at that level that the thing is being fought out. In 1983, an Ram Janmabhoomi Mukti or something, Andolan, is founded. So a movement for the liberation of the birthplace of Rama. Founded, by the way, not by BJP people, but by two congressmen, Daudayal Khanna, a local legislative assembly member, by former Prime Minister Gulzari Lal Nanda. Because, I mean, nowadays people think that Congress is an anti-Hindu party. It has a long history of Hindu prominent members. And then of Yogi Avaidhyanatha, Mahant Avaidhyanatha, who was the personal guru of the present Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh. He was from the Hindu Mahasabha. So you see, it's only through the involvement of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, that is part of the same Sangh Parivar as the BJP, that you could say that the BJP was also involved. But even then, you see, Andolan can mean anything. It doesn't mean riots. It doesn't mean a street movement. And what is much less realized is that the Congress party at the time is also working towards the rebuilding of the temple. And so you can see a number of policy decisions of the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in that light. He bans the book of Salman Rushdie, the Satanic Verses. He overrules the Shah Bano verdict about the rights of divorced Muslim women. And so you see, he gives some sweeteners for the Muslim leadership to keep them quiet, and then to the Hindus he's going to give the temple. At that time, this is not a national issue. You see, this is, I mean, it's not very principled, it's horse trading, it's very Congressite, but it has the virtue of being fairly bloodless and effective.
It is useful.
Yeah, and so you see, that book is dedicated to the Kothari brothers,
Yes.
who died in the rioting for the rebuilding of the Ayodhya temple. Their picture is on the backside. Now, my idea is that, of course, it was very brave and so on of them, but at the same time, it was also unnecessary. I've visited his parents at the time, and
Parents of the Kothari brothers?
of the Kothari brothers. And this was in, outskirts of Kolkata. And they, well, yeah, I mean, of course, they were proud of their boys, their picture in the room. But at the same time, of course, I also felt the enormous sadness. And I thought to myself, you see, could this not have been averted? Of course, if Mulayam Singh Yadav, the chief minister, had not ordered his police to shoot, that would have been averted. But could it not have been averted at a higher level? And so this whole street agitation was not really necessary, I now think. Of course, practically all the personal actors in this are dead now, and I have only limited access to the government documents and so on. All this will have to be sought out, what exactly happened. But I imagine that if the BJP and the Congress had worked together on this, rather than trying to steal the issue from one another, something might have worked out.
But aren't you talking about an ideal situation, Dr. Elst, where all political parties work towards the betterment of a country?
Well, these things happen. In 1991, an extremely important event in India's history happened, namely the liberalization, or the beginning of the liberalization, under
Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh. And the reason was that India was bankrupt. They had only exactly 9 days that they could pay their personnel, and then India was officially bankrupt. And so he proposed an austerity program and a devaluation of the rupee and so on. But Manmohan Singh objected, or at least noticed the problem that many people are going to vote against because their own vote bank is not going to like austerity and all that. And then Narasimha Rao contacted BJP leader Vajpayee, and they worked out something together, and they had a majority for this liberalization. So sometimes, for the national interest, yes, such a alliance is possible. So I think that is what should have happened. Anyway, that is not what happened.
Dr. Elst, you've shed light on the various actors that were playing their part in the Ayodhya issue. There is the Janata Dal, there is the Congress, there's the BJP, there are the Mahants, and there is Devraha Baba, who gave a lot of directions to Rajiv Gandhi. So, how did this case play out for everyone? What were their own interests? What was the interest of the Mahants? What was Devraha Baba's inclination towards Ayodhya? So tell us about that.
Well, you do not have to underestimate the genuine conviction of people. So both in the BJP and in Congress and outside, there were many people genuinely attached to this idea of rebuilding the temple. Either people who were personally Rama devotees, or even just people who saw the political rationality of this, and the silliness of making an issue of this. I mean, that a Hindu place of pilgrimage belongs to Hindus, is that not obvious? So yes, I mean, you could solve it peacefully, maybe with bribing the Muslim leadership, as the Congresses want to do. At any rate, you see, many people saw, we don't want to spend our life on this issue. I mean, just do it practically, rationally, and then get it over with. So I think that is at the basis of it, but you also have to see the political calculations. For example, when the mosque gets demolished, by the crowd, not by the BJP, against the will of the BJP, then everybody blames the BJP, and so Narasimha Rao, who is secretly in favor of the temple, nevertheless, as a politician, takes the occasion to harm the BJP. And so he dismisses these BJP state governments. And so to that extent, it's also his party interest that plays. Same thing with the BJP. You see, they take up the issue in 1989, and then they win 2 successive elections thanks to it. So the 1989 elections, they grow from 2 to 86, and then in the 1991 elections, they grow further to, I don't know, 130 or so. They become the largest opposition
Right.
party. But then they drop the issue like a hot potato. So you see, I'm very sure that many people were genuinely attached to the idea of the temple. Nevertheless, political calculations made them take their distance from it. So that is very much also there. In the case of the Janata Dal, there is no doubt that they also had their political calculations. They were more pro-Islamic in this case than their Yadav vote bank would probably feel like. But okay, you see, they too followed their political interest. But you know, they didn't bring the Rama issue. I mean, the solution for the Rama temple any closer. Apparently, by that time, when the issue had become a bit toxic with all the riots and so on, they didn't take it to heart anymore, and so essentially it was left to the courts at that point. Now here, Narasimha Rao kept on pursuing the line that had been taken by Rajiv Gandhi, namely, we let the evidence speak. In 1990, Rajiv Gandhi was in the opposition, and the VP Singh government had fallen, and instead came the Chandrasekhar government, which was in a very strong minority, so it was propped up from the opposition by Congress. So effectively, Rajiv Gandhi was in power again, and so he made sure that the scholars debate was called. This was necessary because in 1989, the eminent historians from JNU had issued a statement denying all the evidence. And so they wanted to say, okay, let's find out for good. What is the real story? And the idea was that if the evidence goes in favor of the temple, then we will rebuild the temple. If the evidence about the history of the site goes against the temple, then no temple. Which is a polite way of saying, let's build the temple, because of course everybody knew that there had been a temple there. And so Narasimha Rao takes up the same line, and he addresses through the president to the Supreme Court the question of, the 1-point reference, as it was called. Forget about all the rest. Tell us, was there a temple? And the Supreme Court refuses to entertain this question. Why? Because they too know that the result can only be one thing, namely, yes, there was a temple. And clearly they don't want that. Because unlike lower courts, the Supreme Court is very much a hotbed of secularism. And it will remain that later on, as we shall see. But so at that point, you see, the situation remains, there has been a demolition, and now let's look elsewhere. Yes, about the demolition, I still owe you one
That
detail.
answer, yes.
One detail, yes. So everybody blames L.K. Advani, who led the ceremony. Actually, and I know it from people who were there. Elke Adwani broke down in tears because the fabled RSS discipline had not worked. And someone else had done this. So the crowd, and you see, many of the members of the Bajrang Dal still say to this day it was spontaneous. That it definitely was not. You see, for most of the rank and file, it was spontaneous. But it had been masterminded somewhat. Technically by an engineer whose name I know, but I leave it to Indian journalists to publicize
it
that.
out.
Yes. I mean, me as a foreigner, speaking only broken Hindi and so on, I needed just a few phone calls to know. And so for an Indian journalist, this must be just a piece of cake. And the man is still alive, so go for it. And then the political mastermind, and this is more convoluted, but you see, apparently in the RSS leadership, it seems that there was a difference of opinion, with some people following the BJP soft line. And I don't know who else. I mean, it's a very secretive organization. They opened up to me because I had written in favor of the temple, unlike all the other Westerners. But still, I mean, I don't know what exactly it is worth, what they told me. And but one thing I know for sure, one of the leaders definitely was on the side of the temple, also practically was in favor of the demolition right away of the mosque. That was Moro Pant Pingle. Of course, also long dead. So anyway, I mean, a few prepared people, you see, who knew the mechanics, they put ropes in strategic points so
bring
that
it
the
down.
boys could pull the
Yes.
thing down.
Yes.
So it was an old building. It was not very dangerous, except for this concrete roof that the British had put in. So that cost the life of at least one of them.
Right.
Anyway, so and then all the boys took a few stones with them as a trophy. So the whole place was cleared the same day. And incidentally, many new temple pieces came to light.
Because
see?
of that demolition.
Yes, you see, so there were archaeological findings at the site by B.B. Lal in the 70s, whom Indira Gandhi personally prohibited him from publicizing. Then there were the findings during the demolition. Then in 2003, the UP High Court ordered a systematic excavation at the site. Then, of course, the foundation of the temple was found. Then, very recently, when the building company, before building the new temple, after the 2019 verdict, then first they have to dig this big hole before they start, filling it up. They too found more pieces, even when they were not looking for it.
All right.
Nevertheless, the temple remains kept coming out. Anyway, so that's the story of the temple. Now the court case. So the Supreme Court didn't want to entertain the court case or that specific reference. But the court case that had started in 1950 kept on meandering its way. And so finally, it is the UP High Court that takes the issue of the evidence seriously. Now, they have all the evidence that the scholars had gathered. You see, in 1990-91, that winter, there was the scholars' debate, but it was really a one-sided debate. You see, all the Hindu scholars, because they were being challenged in the newspapers and so on, there is no evidence, they did take care to find what evidence there was. So there are lots of documentary evidence that proves at least that the Muslim community itself had for centuries been perfectly convinced that of course there had been a temple there. Now, then there was the archaeological evidence, but on the other side there was nothing. And so that, incidentally, is why in 2002 I titled my own book about Ayodhya, the case against the temple. You see, this must have wrong-footed many book buyers because it seems to suggest that I'm going to take a stand against the temple. No, you see, what I wanted to draw attention to was that the evidence against the temple is non-existent. And so that's what the court found when they called the eminent historians to the witness stand. You see, they broke down. It seems that they didn't even find the need to prepare themselves for this test to at least save their face. No, you see, they just broke down. They said, yeah, but I'm not an archaeologist. I never been to Ayodhya. I only signed because my colleagues signed,
And I'm
which is,
just a
of course,
PhD.
exactly what happened.
And I'm just a PhD scholar.
Yeah. And so for the judges, it was clear enough. You see, there is no evidence against the temple. Of course, everything goes in favor of the temple. So their verdict in 2010 could only be one thing. It is, first of all, recognizing this is a Hindu site, and then leaving as much to the Muslims as seemed reasonable. Now, the solution that they came up with was not entirely reasonable because they left the Muslims a piece of land very close to the site, which means that again, you see, Hindus and Muslims would meet every day, and this would maybe not be such a good idea. So that's really the only difference that the Supreme Court case has made. They allotted a place at a greater distance. But then, so the really definitive court case is the one in 2010. It's then that the courts decide, it is the scholarly evidence that has to speak. And then it goes to the Supreme Court, which, as secularists, they don't feel like confirming this verdict, but there's really little else they can do because the scholarly evidence is so decisive. So what do they do instead? Something at which Indian judges are very good, namely postponing, postponing, postponing. They even come up with this idea that, yeah, but there shouldn't be a judicial verdict, there should be a negotiated settlement. Then they bring in Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, who has the great merit of setting up a number of meditation centers in the Middle East. That's exactly what should be done. You see, to bring the Muslim population back to, you see, the basis of the human consciousness and teach them the best that Hindu civilization has to offer. But of course, it means that he has to be very careful with what he says about Islam. He's absolutely not the best person to lead that kind of negotiation. Anyway, so at that point, the BJP does have an important merit, namely the law minister, nudges the judges, come on, you see, get to work. Come on. And so on the 9th of November 2019, which is on the anniversary of the first stone, the Shilanyas in 1989, they definitively give the site or give back the site to the Hindus and give some, symbolic other side to the Muslims. So that's it. That is the definitive situation. Now the temple is being rebuilt. It's going to open sometime in January, I think. And it ought to be just one of the many Hindu sacred sites. Although I must warn you that the terrorists, who fortunately have become much fewer the last years, will consider it a target par excellence. You'll have to have very solid security there because you have to be lucky every time, they have to be lucky only once.
Dr. Elst, I would like to go back to one question. This is purely hypothetical. Like you said, and I agree with it, there was no need for such a violent act as bringing down the mosque
Yes.
to rebuild the temple, to make place for the temple. Many people would agree with that. But I feel that there was this sequence of events which were leading to that. The appearance of the idols of Ramlala in the Janmasthan area, then the various negotiations with various political parties and in the powers that be,
Yeah.
which were not bearing any fruit. Then this status quo which the successive governments wanted to maintain. So, do you think the patience of the people involved in the movement was exhausted by then? And in 1992, that came to an end. You say that the movement was maybe the demolition was planned. One suspects that
Yeah.
because it can't happen spontaneously, as
Yeah.
people proved. But was it the impatience of people that came up?
Well, impatience has everything to do with it. You see, the Supreme Court had promised a verdict about the issue itself before 6 December. And, it hadn't come. And the BJP, of course, was also testing their patience. You see, they said, well, what is this? You see, for years now we are fighting for this temple. Now we are here. We have a BJP chief minister. The situation is fine. Let's start working on the temple, which means let's first demolish the mosque. And so the BJP disappointed them in that. In fact, you could say that the BJP went there with the intention of showing the secularists, look, we can keep control over the Hindu crowds. You can't, but we can. Look how secular we are. Well, I noticed that the boys didn't like that. I don't know if such a thing is still possible today. Uh, I hear about quite some militancy at a popular level, like, for instance, about the life in villages and so on. Really, I don't know much, but I just hear that in many villages they boycott Islamic traders. I know about it, cow vigilance and so on. Nevertheless, when I look at the young people today versus 30 years ago, they may well be less committed to Hinduism than they used to be. But I'm not sure of that. You see, there's no opinion poll about that. But I have the impression that the openness to Americanization and so on is there. Also, there is a demographic shift. You see, the Muslim population is becoming ever bigger. Although, on the other hand, it is also subject to Americanization. There is, at least in Kerala, a strong movement of ex-Muslims. And that's in consonance with what you see happening in the Arab countries, where effectively many people are leaving Islam, even though for society maybe they have to keep it discreet, but nevertheless it's really happening. And the clerics, the Maulvis also realize it very much. So Islam is also not so militant anymore. Maybe the future will be more, with temple disputes at least, will be more focused on the judiciary, like there are proceedings going on about the Kashi Vishwanath and the Krishna Janmabhoomi. And then, in general, I think these temple disputes are fairly unfortunate. You see, maybe in the case of the Ram Janmabhoomi, it was the best that could happen. It was the site itself that mattered. But so there are very many temples destroyed where, the temple is not the site, where, a temple can always be rebuilt in the future. I think that the thing to do is to reconvert the Muslims, and they themselves will bring their own sacred sites. So, You see, with this Uday Stalin saying that we have to eradicate Sanatana Dharma, you have to realize that there are people in India who have been saying that all along. You see, maybe not all Christians are convinced of this, but all Christian missionaries certainly are. You know, when they want to Christianize India, it means to
Eradicating,
destroy
yes,
Hinduism.
Yes. Simple.
And so the same thing has been there for centuries with Islam. Let's wake up to reality. You see, people want to eradicate Hinduism. And so Stalin said it explicitly, but it's been there all along. Now, you could say the opposite thing. That's what the Arya Samaj has been saying since the 19th century. That's what the Gharvapasi people in the Vishnu Upanishad are now saying, is that, you know, you can bring these people back to their ancestral culture. And, you know, that doesn't mean that you have to make them practice sati and so on again. Ancient, it's not really theologically Hindu practices, but at least practices that existed in some classes of Hindu society. And so, I mean, all these things they are certainly going to throw at you. Oh, yeah, but you see all the evils of Hindu society, you don't want to bring them back, do you? No, of course, you see, it has changed. The Bible is full of slavery, for example, yet I don't hear any contemporary Christians saying, oh, we have to bring back slavery. You see, it's a very sane thing to bring people back to their roots. Of course, it's they themselves who have to do it. You can only facilitate it, create the atmosphere, and provide the necessary information. But you know that can be done. That's the same thing to do. In this case, in the 90s, 80s and 90s, Ram Sarup and Sitaram Goel busied themselves with, you know, bringing together the historical and theological information about Islam. Practically nobody has continued that work. About history, yes, there are some really promising younger historians, you know, whose knowledge of detail about different episodes of Muslim history in India is commendable. About theology, I don't see it so much. But anyway, now you have the internet. Now you are totally, what they say, branché. You are connected with all the similar developments that are taking place in the West. You have these critical studies of Islam, not just about how evil Islam has been, but also how mistaken it is. You see, people don't like to be reminded of, you know, yeah, my ancestors did all these things wrong. But when you point out that Islam is just a huge mistake, that Christianity is a huge mistake, some minor Hindu beliefs are also mistakes. But the difference is that if with a rational scientific mind you approach Christianity and Islam, you find that their core beliefs are untenable.
Yes.
Whereas in the case of Hinduism, yeah, there is some dead wood that should go, but the
Core is
heart
strong.
of the matter is very sane, is very humane. So that's my solution. You know, if at least if you think that communal conflict is a problem.
It is.
It is also alleged that Hindu kings did to Buddhist establishments that which Muslims did to Hindu establishments. That again is very incorrect. It is wishful thinking on the part of the secularists. And to some extent they will probably really believe this because, you know, one thing you have to know about Nehruvian secularism is that it is extremely superficial. You see, their knowledge of religion is nothing. You see, first of all, they have a Hindu background. Hinduism was never very interested in other religions. You see, when the Syrian Christians came to Kerala or the Parsis came to Gujarat, the Hindus gave them a place in, you know, on their land and in their society without asking questions. They didn't ask you, what is this that you do in this church of yours? You see, they just let them. Studies of Christian doctrine only start the moment Christian missionaries in the 17th century start attacking Hinduism.
Okay.
You see, they study Hinduism, they find fault with it, they, you know, publicize that, then Hindus fight back. But so of themselves, they don't do that at all. The first study of Islam is one chapter about the Quran in the Satyartha Prakash, the founding text of the Arya Samaj in 1870, thereabouts. So this Hindu background partly explains why they have no knowledge of religion. But then it gets seriously aggravated by their, you know, leaving religion altogether. And so they don't know how it feels to be religious. You know, like for instance, an argument that always comes back, oh, it's only for loot, it's only for lucre, it's, you know, economic. And this religion, no, you see, many people care about religion.
Yes.
Osama bin Laden was a billionaire. He could have lived his life in luxury, yet he lived his life in the caves of Afghanistan. And later as a fugitive living in hiding in Pakistan. You see, some people really sacrifice material goods for the religious values. And so that's something secularists just don't want to understand. So the relation between Hinduism and Buddhism, they completely misunderstand. First of all, Buddhism is not really a different religion. The Buddha never defined himself as a religion founder. He founded one particular sect, one sampradaya, one organization, one monastic network, and that's it. And what he pursued was liberation, which existed all around him. He had been the pupil of two Sankhya teachers. In fact, he starts his career with these 4 meetings, one of whom is a sadhu. So clearly there were already people pursuing liberation and getting relatively far in it. So he steps in the footsteps of the earlier Buddhas. That's in fact what he says very explicitly. So it's not really 2 religions. Then what happens with Buddhism is that there was some polemic against it, like by Shankara, which is not at all to say that Shankara destroyed Buddhist temples or anything. No, he just gave his idea, and the other side gave their idea. But yes, you see, at some point, Buddhism fell in disfavor with the masses. Buddhism only really means Buddhist monasteries. You see, lay disciples are not
few.
really committed to Buddhism. You see, even now the neo-Buddhists, you know, the Ambedkarites, often, as sociologists have found, have a house altar with the statue of the Buddha and a picture of Ambedkar, but often also other Hindu gods. So that hasn't disappeared, and so that's the history of Buddhism throughout. Like, for example, in Japan you have all these temples for Saraswati, Benzai Ten. And you know, other Vedic gods have been transported by no one else except Buddhist monks all the way to Japan. Or for instance, in Thailand you have quite a few worship centers for Brahma. And indeed you see in the story of the Buddha, it is Indra and Brahma who ask him to start teaching rather than keep it for himself. So it's not really so different. But at some points, you see, Buddhism fell into disfavor. There were no Buddhists anymore to serve Buddhist temples. And by the way, secularists also show their superficiality to call these stupas. A stupa is something else than a temple. A stupa is like an artificial hill with a corpse in it, or at least a relic,
A relic,
like
yes.
a tooth of the Buddha or so. And then there are monasteries, which are another thing again. Anyway, so sometimes you see these temples fall empty. And what is then often done is that the worship is continued, but not so much for the Buddha anymore. Or for a Buddha statue that is given some, embellishments and so on, so that it's not really a Buddha anymore. Like in Tamil Nadu last year, there was a court case over a local temple that had been built around a Buddha that had been found in the field, and that Buddha statue was broken, and they had like pasted together, but it looked a bit funny, you see, and so the name in Tamil referred to that clumsy look, and that object was worshipped by the local villagers. Now that's a very typical Hindu thing to do.
Yes.
You find something sacred and you start worshipping
Worshipping
it.
it.
I had a friend who did these diggings in Bastar, a tribal region, and so you see the, big white scholars. They had local porters, just like in the colonial age, and so when they dug up Murti that had been found there, their porters started worshipping the Murti. You see, that's the Hindu thing to do. And so this Buddha, non-Buddha, at any rate, some local Buddhists took it to court. They said, we want this. Well, you see, but you had it already. You
Yeah.
could perfectly go there and worship the Buddha if that's what you want. And then the court decided, you see, Tamil anti-Hindu decided, no, this must be off limits. You can't worship this except if you give it back to the Buddhists and they do what
Their own
they
thing.
think is necessary, which goes against the Places of Worship Act of 1991,
Right.
which freezes all places of worship except for Ayodhya as they were in 1947. So I don't know now what is going to come of it, but at any rate, it illustrates one aspect of the place of Buddhism within Hinduism. Now, in 1194, when the Muslim invaders destroy all the Buddhist establishments and kill all the Buddhists, it's really the end of Buddhism. Because, you see, Hinduism is passed on from father to son in the, the whole Brahmin establishment is very much in the family, or sons are exchanged to be, educated by a colleague. But in the case of Buddhism, it's these monasteries or nothing. And so Buddhism disappears, but these Buddhist establishments often remain.
Right.
Like the Mahabodhi temple was not destroyed. And so it is Shaivite monks who take care of it. And so Buddhists ought to give some gratitude to those people. And so now it is again used for Buddhist worship, even though the committee constituted to manage the place is still 5 Hindus to 4 Buddhists, as they say. I mean, I would say 9 Hindus,
All right.
of whom 4 are Buddhists.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
But so at any rate, there's no case of Hindus going to destroy Buddhist temples the way that had been done with Shaiva temples and so on. That's pure projection. And at the time, in the 90s, Sitaram Goel challenged the eminent historians. Okay. In fact, it's in an incident where some secularist historian had said, and 1,000 years ago, the blood flowed in the Buddhist temples because Hindus, da 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 da. So Sitaram Goel said, okay, can you name one case of this? I'm asking not 2 cases, just one. And so far we haven't heard of it. So no, you see, what Muslims did was not honest revenge for what Hindus had done to Buddhists. That has nothing to do with it. On the contrary, Muslims did exactly the same to Buddhists as they had done to
Others.
non-Buddhist Hindus.
Yes.
And this again, not only in India, all of Central Asia, like the Bamyan Buddhas.
Yes.
So you see there again, Hindus may perfectly plead innocent.
But we know of Pushyamitra Shunga who did break some temples, but then he also rebuilt some Buddhist temples.
No. No, watch out, because the phrase you now use has been used by Audrey Truschke to defend Aurangzeb. You see, she says, okay, Aurangzeb, you see, destroyed a few Hindu temples. She estimates it at 12.
Okay.
Okay?
That's it.
Yeah. But no. She says, okay, he may have destroyed some temples. If you really insist, he may have.
Okay.
But
He
he
also
also
rebuilt.
protected many temples. Now, from whom did he protect those temples? It's a good phrase, you see, for any trial lawyer. You go in court and you say, you're my client. Yes, the facts are proven. He is a murderer, but he also left many people alive. Anyway, but so the case of Pushyamitra Shunga, yeah, that is often cited. Now, we know that, you see, Pushyamitra and his dynasty, they did a lot of Buddhist building.
Yes.
And as for this destruction or this killing, it's not so much temple destruction, it's killing of Buddhist monks. That is what he's accused of. Now that comes from a Buddhist source, the Ashoka Avadana. And what that says is, first, that Ashoka killed a lot of non-Buddhists. Ashoka was a Buddhist, not just after the Kalinga War, he was already a Buddhist since his youth.
Yes.
In reality. But so he had something against the Nirgranthas. There's speculation how far this means the giants, anyway, one of the sects at the time. And so at one point he awards a prize for whoever brings the head of a Nirgrantha monk. And so people can go collect the reward. And then someone brings the head of one of his brothers. In fact, Ashoka comes to power by killing all his brothers.
Yes.
And because he's not really the legitimate heir apparent. But so this Vita Ashoka, he lives alive. And so he becomes a Nirgrantha monk. And then the head of his beloved brother is brought. And then he realizes, what am I doing? So he stops this. So the story is not about Pushyamitra Shunga, it's about Ashoka, the revered Ashoka, about whom even the great scholar Patrick Olivelle has just recently published another book, who was, of course, glorified by Nehru. So this Ashoka was a bit of a shady character. At any rate, it's of him that this has been described not by his enemies, but by Buddhists. Now, then the story is projected onto Pushyamitra by Buddhists because, they want to delegitimize his rule, because after Ashoka, of course, it's no longer Buddhists in power. So in terms of patronage to their establishments, that must have made a difference. So they are very much against Pushyamitra Shunga. So they project this story onto Pushyamitra Shunga. Only now it becomes a miracle story. Because there is some magician monk who produces heads at will, balloons that look like heads. And so if you want to go and collect the reward, you don't need to actually kill someone. You can just
conjure some.
Yes. And so you see, that way they flatter themselves. No, we didn't really kill any Hindus,
Acha.
yeah,
Okay.
or Buddhists in this case. No killing was done, but nevertheless, this shows you what man Pushyamindra Shunga was. So this story isn't reliable, and in fact, it testifies about who Ashoka was. So no, I mean there are these stories. Yes, I know. Even then, you see, suppose they had been true, they would have been a trifle compared to what Islam has done. Anyway, of course, you see, all these things happen in history. I hope they never happen again. And I think that is possible. I think India has been making great strides the last decades specifically that I myself have seen. So, of course, the progress in development that the BJP always talks about is indeed there. You know, I mean, for Western tourists, for example, it must be great the progress that is made.
Yes.
You know, they have English toilets in the hotels nowadays. And, you know, they have smartphones. One of the old problems was the complete lack of communication in India. You were in the middle of nowhere. And now, you know, it's everywhere. So, but you see, the development is not an issue. Indira Gandhi also promised development. She didn't deliver, whereas Modi does. That's the difference. But so, as a political goal, you know, development, yeah, of course you have to do materially the best that is possible. But that's not all that governing is about. And so in terms of creating a better atmosphere at the religious level, I can't say that the BJP has done much. It certainly hasn't created a level playing field where the discriminations against Hindus that the constitution contains have been abolished. It hasn't done anything in that respect. But there are a few good things that have been done, like, for instance, terrorism. You know, a very acute thing. You know, I mean, here in the metro or even in many temples, you have these metal gates, you know, for security. I mean, and so in 2000, 2005, these things were damn necessary.
Yes.
And you see, even though the Congress and certainly the communists with whom they were allied under Manmohan Singh, even though they are friends with the Breaking India forces, nevertheless they were bearing the brunt of terrorism. You see, I mean, all these attacks against Mumbai and so on took place under Congress rule. And so some insider has explained that very often the police was on the trail of some terrorist plot, and they were sabotaged by the politicians. You know, that's secularism in practice. And so today, the police is given a free hand. And so you see, with of course the advance in technology and so on, it is now more and more possible, just like in Europe, in India, more and more possible to, you know, identify terrorist conspiracies before they actually can do their thing. And so today India is much, much, much safer. And therefore, the whole tension between the communities is much less. It's not nurtured by constant incidents.
True.
I mean, you used to have news every day that soldiers in Kashmir have been killed and civilians in Varanasi, for example. That temple I knew very well. I was the personal, I had the priest there as my landlord.
Okay.
I lived in a place, controlled by him. And this was Veer Bhadram Mishra. So in, I think, 2006, thereabouts, there was an attack on his temple. So there was a perfectly peaceful thing. It was the Hanuman temple in Varanasi, quite a famous temple. And so many people who just went about their business suddenly were killed. He came on TV, he became very popular with the secularists when he called on Hindus not to take revenge,
Okay.
which, I think was the sane thing to do. But so you see, that was life back then. And so that really has changed. And so that is very favorable to the normalization of the relations between the
Two
religious communities.
That's true. So this has been a great conversation, Dr. Elst. I thank you for casting your very, very sharp eye on so many aspects of Ayodhya, the politics around it, the people involved, and of course, very great solutions for the way forward for India to develop as a country
Yeah.
and to prosper, nurturing all its communities. Thank you so much for being with us.